The United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres is calling on leaders to get serious and deliver at next week's United Nations General Assembly. The UN chief said peace, climate, gender equality, development, financing and UN reform are among the priorities. I had the chance to speak with Junhua, the United Nations Under-Secretary-General for Economic and Social Affairs. I began by asking him what progress the international community has made on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development.
Since I stepped into this role in 2022, I myself have seen a mix of encouraging progress and also some tough realities. The world has been facing a really challenging backdrop. You name it, conflicts, climate crisis, and the economic instabilities. I would say that despite all of that, there has been a very strong commitment by all stakeholders to the 2030 agenda. There are real signs of the progress. Let me just give you a few examples. For today, over half of the global population has access to some form of the social protection. More than 90% of the people worldwide now have electricity. Internet access has jumped by about 70% since 2015. We are also seeing more girls completing their schoolings. Gender gaps in education continue to narrow worldwide. These are not just numbers. They are real people whose lives are changing for the better. At the same time, perhaps not as visible as we anticipated, are the efforts on the means to achieve the SDGs. Science, technology, and innovation have become central to how countries approach development. And this is particularly important for countries often left behind, like the small island developing states and the least developed countries. The other thing that I want to highlight is on financing side. There is a growing recognition that the developing countries need better access to long-term affordable financing. This is something that we addressed in the recently held the fourth International Conference on Financing for Development. We have also put a big focus on capacity building. My department, the UNDESA, has helped more than 90 countries with the customized support to achieve the SDGs. Tools like the UN Data Commons are giving governments better ways to track the progress and make the faster, smarter decisions. Well, that said, we also have to be very honest. The progress isn't where it needs to be. Only about a third of the SDG targets are on track to be met by 2030. And more than 18% are actually moving in the wrong direction. That should be a wake-up call for a lot of this. The hopeful part is we know what works. We have seen progress in places where there's a strong leadership, smart investment, and real inclusion. So, put a short, the road ahead is steep, but the 2030 agenda, in my conviction, is very much achievable if we act with the sense of the urgency and if we do it together.
Now, the financing conference that you talked about, and we looked at the outcomes there, how can those outcomes help developing nations who are still struggling with financial challenges?
You are right. Global community came together to Seville with the common objective to renew the global financing for development framework. Well, from rising debt and falling investment to shrinking aid, the current system doesn't fit for the purpose. That's the common agreement or common conclusions by almost all the member states and other stakeholders. So we believe the FFD4 actually provided a very strong opportunity to change the course. It was a chance to mobilize finance and reform the rules of the system to put the people's needs at the center. You may witness the discussions in Seville a couple of months ago. The outcome document, we call it the Seville Commitment, adopted by consensus, actually contains a very strong package of the important actions. Those actions include catalyzing investment to close the $4 trillion SDG financing gap. The commitment that also calls for tripling the MDB lending capacity, increasing domestic resource mobilization, and leveraging private finance. The outcome calls for addressing debt pressure. That is a very common challenge for almost all the developing countries. The actions include through a new debt facility at a multilateral institution to lower the cost of the borrowing. And it also calls for reforming the international financial architecture and increasing access to emergency funding to better protect the countries during the shocks. The outcome document commits to enhance developing countries' voices in international financial institutions, to reform the governance at the international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF.
Now, this October, the United Nations will mark its 80th anniversary of its founding. What are your thoughts on what the organization has accomplished so far, and what are your expectations for the future?
Well, a good and challenging question. In my view, UN's 80-year journey represents a remarkable achievement, and it also witnessed a sobering challenge. The UN has shown a very extraordinary capacity to evolve. Its ability to build a consensus on complex issues like the financing and climate agreements shows that multilateralism can yield real results. This is possible even with the different opinions, different interests among the member states, among the stakeholders. That said, we cannot ignore the gap between the aspiration and the implementation as far as the UN system is concerned. Geopolitical tensions, rising nationalisms, and inequalities threaten the international cooperation that sustainable development requires. And looking ahead, I believe UN's relevance will depend on its ability to adapt. Multilateralism remains our best hope for global solutions, but it requires ongoing reform and adequate resourcing. For my department, it means strengthening our capacity for integrated policy making while ensuring that the global frameworks support national actions. We have to foster the conditions necessary for genuine collective actions. And really, to me, to the UN, to the whole membership, the choice is very quite stark. Retreat into fragmentation or progress with solidarity and cooperation. The UN's next decade will be defined by whether we can translate our accumulated wisdom into concrete pathways for effective global governance.
Now, you will serve as the Conference Secretary-General at the Second World Summit for Social Development. That'll take place in Doha, in Qatar, in November. What are your expectations for that conference?
Well, I see the summit as a pivotal moment for the social development and the global community. That's also the reflection from the entire membership. We have made undeniable progress since Copenhagen summit 30 years ago. Poverty has declined and global wealth has grown. But the reality is, too many people are still being left behind. Millions still live in multidimensional poverty, lack of social protection coverage, or have no access to quality education and decent work. Then there are new and growing challenges, very alarmingly, like the digital divide, demographic shifts, and the impacts of the climate change, very severe on those vulnerable countries. The summit in Doha is our opportunity to reset and refocus global and national development efforts towards a people-centered approach. It's also an opportunity to forge stronger partnerships, as well as to build more inclusive institutions that accelerate progress. The summit, in my view, must be a moment where we ensure that those most affected stand to benefit and have the real voice in shaping these solutions. This, of course, includes women, youth, older persons, persons with disabilities, and indigenous peoples. It has to be a catalyst for the future that works for everyone, as we committed to leave no one behind.
Mr. Lee, you talked a moment ago about the United Nations being a very powerful vehicle for multilateral cooperation. I mean, what message would you like to share with the international community about the importance of history, of peace, and of that very cooperation that you talk about?
Well, drawing from 8 decades of the UN experience, I would emphasize that historical memory is our compass in navigating today's complex landscape. Our greatest achievements have emerged from the patient work of the multilateral dialogue and constructive compromises, and not from the isolation. These are the lessons of the UN's journey from the 2 devastating world wars to today's interconnected crisis. Paris Agreement and the SDGs came from the recognition that shared challenges demand shared solutions. Namely, global challenges called for the global solutions. History teaches us that retreat into isolation, nationalism, or fragmentation doesn't eliminate the global problems. On the contrary, it makes those problems and challenges more dangerous and less manageable. Peace today is not merely the absence of the conflict. It demands justice, equity, unity, and hope. When inequalities persist and many groups feel excluded from the prosperity, we actually create conditions for instability. Therefore, multilateral cooperation is a very practical necessity for addressing the root causes of the conflict. To the international community, I would like to say, our choice is not between the national sovereignty or international cooperation. Rather, it is between the managed interdependence and destabilization fragmentation. the mechanism of the multilateralism can be quite slow, but they are our best tools for ensuring that globalization serves humanity rather than dividing it.
Mr. Lee, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks.
We now turn to the United Nations Capital Development Fund. The program's mission is to support job creation, drive sustainable economic growth, and promote fair prosperity in developing countries. I spoke with Pradeep Kurukulasuriya, the fund's executive secretary, and asked him for his thoughts on the UN's 80th anniversary and what comes next.
Well, I mean, I think we first need to reflect on the fact that, when the United Nations was first created, it was a Secretary-General at the time that famously put it, it wasn't created to take mankind to heaven, but rather to save us from hell. And I think the role of the United Nations in preventing global conflict and mitigating human suffering, I think that's something that has been pivotal to the fundamental sort of foundation of why the UN exists. Peace and security, rather than, I suppose, pursuing objectives that are not really grounded in the realities that we face. But having said that, we are in a world where there's rising debt, there's climate vulnerability, there's a huge finance divide, all of which is really pointing to a number of challenges that the development world is facing. So in many ways, it almost seems like work that is unfinished. Has a lot happened? Of course. But at the same time, I think we've seen through the Finance for Development conference that recently took place in Seville, Spain, that much more needs to be done in terms of driving capital, driving finance to development priorities around the world. So, in a nutshell, I think the organization has achieved a lot over the last 80 years, but certainly there's a lot more that needs to be done.
Now, in your previous role as the Executive Coordinator for Environmental Finance for the UN Development Programme, you oversaw a $5 billion nature, climate and energy finance portfolio that was over 140 countries. How do you use that experience, that knowledge, to determine the future direction of the UN Capital Development Fund?
Indeed. I mean, I think I have the privilege of having worked with the United Nations Development Programme to try and help countries access resourcing to address many of their priorities on nature, climate, energy, not for the sake of those topics in themselves, but rather because of the intricate interface with development that needs to, advance, and it's very much underpinned by the ecosystem-based energy accessibility, and of course the increasing incidence of weather-related events that countries have to address. And I think what I have learned from that experience is that ultimately, for the scale of impact that we need to see, it's not really just about the public sector. It is, I think, more relevant than ever before is how we can engage and crowd in private finance to help address the kinds of solutions that we need from a job perspective, but also rather from a human development angle. So for me, I think the opportunity that certainly the United Nations Capital Development Fund now presents, because of its unique capital mandate and the fact that it's not credit rated, it's able to absorb risks in a way that no other UN entity can, and many other, including multilateral development banks or development finance institutions cannot. I feel like we have an immense role to play in crowding in private capital to be an integral part of the development solution. So that's what we're now trying to do here at UN Capital Development Fund.
Right, I want to talk a little bit more about funding. I mean, you've been in your new role as the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Capital Development Fund for a little over a year right now. The fund's investment mandate is to augment the deployment, I'm quoting here, of grants, loans and guarantees in the form of blended finance. When you talk about private funding, is that what goes to blending finance?
Yeah, I mean, look, at the end of the day, what we're talking about is that there is, the global economy is in the order of what, 450, 480, nearly $500 trillion. That's the combined accumulation of sort of global assets, if you like. How much of that is making its way to the developing world? Less than 4%. Right, the remainder is actually circulating within the developed countries, the richest countries in the world. So we clearly have an issue in terms of, it's not that there isn't resourcing around, it's not getting to where it needs to go in the form and shape and speed that we need that to happen. Why is that? It's because one of the things is risk. There are far too many risks associated with that finance going to certain parts of the world, and that needs to be addressed. So blended financing is really when you start using very scarce public money to try and create the conditions that are appropriate for private finance to get to work, for market solutions to get to work. And that is really the catalytic role that UNCDF is now trying to advance. Can we take $1 of public money and turn it into $4 or $5, which is private finance that's coming in? Now, has this worked? In theory, I have to say, and the research suggests that it hasn't worked in quite the way it has been envisaged. Most of the blending that is currently happening is when public money is essentially de-risking other forms of public money. So, money from tax receipts de-risks money from, foundations or philanthropy or, that sort of makeup. What we really need to see is private finance being crowded in, and we're certainly seeing the emerging prospects of that working out, especially if public money is deployed through an appropriate risk-absorbing facility. And that's where UNCDF is essentially trying to play. And we see that this has worked. I mean, even in countries that are in conflict, I don't want to name the country because of security reasons, but in one of the most, well-known countries where there's significant conflict, we've demonstrated just through the deployment of $1 million that you can unlock $10 million of private capital within that local economy. Tanzania recently issued a water bond, which we spent about $1 million trying to raise that bond. But we, to set up the bond, it raised about $24 million, 65% of which came from domestic investors. So it is possible through the sort of the smart use of public finance to try and crowd in private capital that ultimately will go a longer way to address the challenges that we're talking about than pure public funds.
I want to turn now to the impact that, our current models of trade have on climate change. You said recently that the maritime shipping industry is the backbone of global trade, moving about 90% of the world's goods, driving economies and reducing poverty. However, the downside is that it also accounts for nearly 3% of global greenhouse gases. How do you balance that? How do you get that rectified?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, and this is a conversation that recently took place on the margins of the United Nations Oceans Conference in Nice, where there is a recognition by the shipping industry that as much as it plays an important role in the global economic system, it also has a responsibility in terms of looking at its impact on the ecosystem in which it is able to transact. Greening of fleets, of port infrastructure, rethinking supply chains, scaling eco-friendly ship designs, managing wastewater and ballast water sustainably. I mean, all of these things do ultimately also incur costs on the shipping industry that they also have a vested interest to try and reduce. So I think it is important to first recognize that the shipping industry is not, averse to making the right types of investments, but we need to figure out ways in which the financing that's needed is brought to bear to allow them to make those kinds of adjustments. So finance ultimately does form, an important part of the missing link, and certainly in vulnerable countries around the world where ports and fleets play an important role in their overall economic makeup. We got to find ways in which they are also able to access the larger streams of private capital that will allow them to move in this direction. And this is over and beyond the kind of regulations and policy change that's also needed to incentivize the right type of behavioral change within the private sector. Now, at UNCDF, we are working very hard to try and de-risk investments in marine conservation, in the blue economy sector. And we've seen, success through our funds, such as the Global Fund for Coral Reefs, and our partnerships with the United Nations Development Program and the United Nations Environment Program. When we do come together as one, and that is, again, an important part of the United Nations system, it is possible to try and attract private investment into sustainable ocean-based enterprises.
There are a number of countries around the world right now who are rethinking their supply chain models, or also looking at alternative trade partners, and that's all because the very aggressive tariff regime that's being implemented by the United States. Will this have an effect on the climate crisis?
I think we are at a pivotal moment for global development, and not just because of one policy of a country or another, but I think there is a recognition that there is a broader trend of fragmentation in global cooperation. And while yes, tariff policies will have an impact one way or another, I think there are also other bigger issues that the world is trying to grapple. The scale of the impacts that we're facing, the scale of the finance that's needed, the speed at which financial solutions must come to bear, so that solutions, in investments, whether it is for climate or for nature, do take place at the right pace and in the right places. I think there are lots of issues that are coming together, and perhaps what's happening on the trade side of things because of the tariff change policies just helps fast track actions and allows and forces us to almost think in a system. Least developed countries and small island developing countries that certainly are our focus are already facing huge constraints, with constrained fiscal space, with vulnerability to weather-related events, and they are often the collateral damage in these kinds of global shifts. In fact, a recent paper that we had prepared through our partnership with ISF Advisors that you can find online, indicated that proactive investments in these sorts of difficult contexts can be a cost-effective strategy to reduce future risks and shocks. And I think this really underlines the urgency of mobilizing blended finance through partnerships to catalyze capital in ways that de-risk investments, build resilient infrastructure, promote low carbon growth. These are all very important for developing countries, no less for job creation and addressing the needs of youth.
Okay, so we are going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.